Okay, I want to talk about entity optimization for AI search, basically reducing ambiguity and increasing retrievability. So I think the first thing to note is that entity optimization isn't like a checklist of SEO GEO tactics. It's a holistic process. And that process has several steps in it. And what I did is I wrote an article that kind of goes through the strategy overall. It's not like a checklist necessarily, so it's a little hard to pull the pieces out, but I'll do my best. Um, I think the first step is entity resolution. So if we think about what's your ultimate goal, it's to associate your brand with core entities of relevance. So like maybe you're a software company, you want to be associated with enterprise SEO software. For me, I want to be associated with AI search consulting. But before you worry about that, you need to make sure the AI assistants can confidently determine who you are by understanding that all the references to your brand refer to the same real world entity. And so we have the classic example of Apple. Google or AI assistants need to know that refers to the tech company versus the fruit. That is called entity resolution. That kind of distinction of understanding what the entity is and what it's associated with. So one tactic you can use is organization schema. This specifically is recommended by Google to disambiguate an organization. So it'd include things like your name, if you had an alternate name, your URL, your physical or contact details, and then same as, which are links to external profiles like your social profiles or other profiles that you have on the web. So same as can be very powerful for connecting your entity across the web. Some other steps you can take include like using one primary brand name consistently, stating what the company or brand is on the homepage, the about page, and in the footer works surprisingly well. Mention alternate names, abbreviations, or previous names where needed. Keep business details, social profiles, descriptions, etc. consistent, and then use persistent URLs for the entity and its important people or products. So the goal isn't necessarily like we need to get the brand mentioned everywhere. It's more about minimizing entity ambiguity through repeatable reinforcing signals. So that's sort of the big takeaway. Um, I'll go into some other kind of like ancillary topics. So we talk about like vectors or semantic search. Um, Basically, these turn text or other media into embeddings or numerical vectors that encode semantic information. If we think about like a couple of brands, so like let's say brand A has the following semantic connections, which are marketing, business, software, and miscellaneous. And then brand B is connected to, SEO, AI search, generative search, semantic search, content strategy, and enterprise marketing. Brand B is going to live in a much clearer semantic neighborhood, and that's going to likely give it a competitive advantage. So that's sort of the goal, right? Is have a clear semantic neighborhood that your brand lives in. Thirdly, you want to think about letting AI assistants and search engines understand you through brand to attribute relationships. So these are simple subject, predicate, object relationships, or what we call semantic triples. So I have some examples here, like Nike manufactures athletic footwear, Ahrefs provides SEO software, Ethan Lezouk specializes in SEO and GEO. So you can add schema to make relationships explicit by attaching properties to entities. But I would also describe these relationships in clear natural language too, your on-page copy. So you want to replace a vague copy with more entity-rich content that explains the subject, predicate, object relationship, but does so with rich entity language as opposed to like vague pronouns. Um, this gets a little into the weeds, but the next step is to build topical depth around the entity, not just the topical authority of the website. So, like traditional topical authority thinking would ask, like, does this website comprehensively cover the topic? If we're doing entity-oriented thinking, it's more like, is this specific brand meaningfully and repeatedly associated with the topic? So, Calicube, who's a good resource when it comes to like entity optimization, has an idea called niche notability, where instead of trying to become broadly famous, you establish your entity as notable within the specific niche where you want algorithms to understand and recommend it. So, for example, um, if you're brand A and you want to be associated with AI search analytics, publishing 100 AI search articles wouldn't necessarily be enough. You need the broader content ecosystem to repeatedly establish meaningful relationships about you, like that you specialize in AI search analytics, that you develop AI visibility software, that you research AI search behavior, or that you measure brand visibility in LLMs. So we're not just trying to build topical authority around a website, we're trying to build clear relationships between the brand and the topics you want it to be known for. So to that end, you're looking to build a network of corroboration. So you can say on your own site that you're an enterprise AI search analytics platform, but that's just one assertion, and it's not enough for corroboration. But imagine if that same basic relationship appears independently on third-party sites and a variety of third-party sites relevant to your audience. That creates a network of corroboration, giving clarity to your core entity. Um, and you can kind of audit that by looking at your third-party mentions and checking for consistency, and then addressing any inconsistent information out there by potentially reaching out to those third parties and having them update the language on their pages. Because ultimately, I'm not trying to pit mentions against backlinks here. They're both important, but mentions may matter independently of links. For example, Ahrefs had a study where they analyzed 75,000 brands, and they reported that brand mentions showed the strongest correlation with brand visibility in Google AI overviews specifically among the factors that they studied. So basically, this means that if you have an entity-oriented digital PR strategy, it's broader than just getting links to your site. It's about getting your entity discussed in the right context by sources that help establish what your entity is known for. Your entity also needs a home for other sources to reference, and this is called an entity home. So usually the entity home is like an about page, but it could be a home page, or it could be a definition page or a service page. But what's important is that the entity home answers key information about the entity, like who it is, what it does, where it's based, what products it offers or services it offers, which other entities is it meaningfully connected to. All of this information should be mentioned on your entity home, and that gives you like a home base for other sites to link to, reinforcing your entity and its relationships. Because ultimately, we want to think about the website as an entity graph, right? So the entity home defines the node, the rest of the site defines the graph around it, and we want to think of your site as an entity graph. So we want to think about like internal entity linking, where the relationships between entities are easily defined on the site. So for a company, you might have an entity ecosystem that says like it's founded by this person, it creates this product that belongs to this category, it solves this problem, etc., etc. Um, you can reference these relationships in structured data, but you don't think of schema as just decorating web pages. Think of it as a way of expressing your entity model. And going beyond schema, you want these relationships to be mentioned in the on-page text as well, not just in the structured data. It's also important to note that we're looking for credible entity relationships. So it's not just about having more entities. That's not automatically better. It becomes valuable when the relationships on your site are valuable and they provide real world evidence of relationships. So to give you an example, a weak relationship would be like brand A mentions Stanford University. In that instance, Stanford just happens to appear in an article. But a more meaningful relationship might be brand A is a research partnership, has a research partnership with Stanford University. So an entity graph shouldn't simply contain more edges, it should contain defensible edges or more real world evidence of these relationships. In terms of like kind of judging your entity performance, your knowledge panel can be a diagnostic. So you can look at it and then kind of get a sense of like, what does Google understand about this entity? What type does it assign? Which people are associated with it? Which social profiles appear? Which related entities appear? Stuff like that. Um, as a case study, I want to talk about proprietary entities. So I've created basically different projects under the name Hamsterdam. I have Hamsterdam itself, which is weekly SEO GEO news recaps. I have Hamsterdam History, where I look at historical SEO articles. I have Hamsterdam Research, where I look at AI research papers. And I also have Amsterdam Marketing, where I talk about marketing topics. But all of these are separate projects that kind of create proprietary entities. So instead of having just Ethan Lezouk writes SEO articles, it creates a richer network of entities where like Ethan Lezouk created Hamsterdam, Hamsterdam covers SEO, GEO topics, Hamsterdam Research specifically analyzes AI search research. So basically, instead of every piece of content reinforcing only one entity, these proprietary projects can create multiple interconnected entities that reinforce one another. So lastly is how can we kind of measure this? We talked about knowledge panels before, sort of like a diagnostic, but how can we go deeper? So in terms of entity accuracy, we can look at like AI descriptions, we can look at the category that it gets mentioned in, we can look at like associated people or products. We can look at associations, so like associated topics, co-occurring entities, competitors that are associated with the brand or entity, as well as sentiment. For visibility, we can look at citations, we can look at non-branded recommendations, we can evaluate branded SERPs, and then for consensus, we can look at third-party descriptions or look for inconsistencies across those sources. So basically, we're trying to monitor accuracy, not only visibility. So rather than asking how many times did the AI assistant mention us, we'd want to say, what does the AI believe we are? That's a much more useful question. So in terms of takeaways, we can summarize it by asking a list of questions. So on the case of identity, it's can the AI search system identify and disambiguate the entity? In the case of meaning, it's what attributes, categories, topics, people, products, and concepts does the system associate with the entity? For corroboration, it's does the rest of the web reinforce those relationships? For credibility, is there credible evidence explaining why this entity matters for those topics? For retrieval, it's can semantic or vector search, lexical graph, or conventional retrieval systems surface information about the entity for relevant queries? For citation, it's does the entity produce information useful enough to retrieve as supporting evidence? And then for recommendation, it's does the entity surface when the query asks for a solution or category without naming the brand? So we have, entity recognition, entity retrieval, and then entity recommendation. So recommendation is kind of like where brand positioning, entity SEO, semantic search, and AI search start to converge. And that's the end goal of entity optimization. So that's the end of the video, entity optimization for AI search. There's a lot of information, but just remember, it's not like a checklist of actions you take. It's a broader strategy around reducing ambiguity and increasing retrievability. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.